Derek's hand shot up to shield his face the moment my phone appeared. "Not now, Natalie," he muttered, stepping behind our son Tyler as I tried to capture the moment. For 18 years I'd been the family photographer documenting every milestone, every celebration. But today, at our son's high school graduation, something felt different. Every time I raised my camera, Derek would turn away, find an excuse to step out of frame, or suddenly become intensely interested in his program. It wasn't until I saw the woman in the third row, blonde, unfamiliar, pointing her own camera directly at my husband, that the pieces began falling into place. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning of Tyler's graduation dawned crisp and clear in Millbrook, Colorado, the kind of perfect spring day that made our little mountain town look like a postcard. I'd been up since 5, pressing Tyler's cap and gown, arranging the breakfast spread, and charging all my camera equipment. This was the day I'd been planning for months, our only child's high school graduation, the culmination of 18 years of scraped knees, science fair projects, and late-night homework sessions. Derek emerged from the shower with his usual efficiency, already dressed in the navy suit I'd picked out for him weeks ago. He looked handsome, distinguished even, with his graying temples and the confident bearing that had first attracted me 22 years ago when we'd met at a college career fair. He was studying architecture then, full of dreams about designing sustainable buildings that would change the world. I was majoring in communications, harboring my own ambitions of becoming a documentary filmmaker. "You ready for this?" I asked, adjusting his tie with the familiar intimacy of 2 decades together. Our reflection in the bedroom mirror showed what anyone would consider a successful couple. Well-dressed, well-groomed, the picture of suburban prosperity. "As ready as any parent can be for their kid to grow up," he replied, but something in his voice felt rehearsed, like he was reading lines from a script he'd memorized. Derek had always been measured in his responses, careful with his words, but lately there was a distance in his manner that I couldn't quite place. Tyler bounded downstairs with the nervous energy of an 18-year-old on the verge of adulthood. At 6'2", he towered over me now, but I could still see traces of the little boy who used to climb into our bed during thunderstorms. His excitement was infectious, and for a moment, the strange tension I'd been feeling about Derek melted away. "Mom, you're not going to cry during the ceremony, are you?" Tyler teased, stealing a piece of bacon from the platter I'd arranged on our kitchen island. "I make no promises," I laughed, capturing his grin with my phone. "This is what mothers do, sweet. We document everything so we can embarrass you later." Derek barely touched his breakfast, checking his phone repeatedly with the kind of focused attention he usually reserved for work emergencies. As the head of planning and development for Millbrook County, he was accustomed to being in demand, but today felt different. He seemed distracted, almost agitated, in a way that had nothing to do with parental emotion. "Everything okay at work?" I asked, refilling his coffee cup. "Fine," he said too quickly, sliding his phone into his jacket pocket. "Just some last-minute issues with the Henderson project. You know how it is." I did know how it was. Derek's job required him to balance the competing interests of developers, environmental groups, and town residents, often putting him in the spotlight at public meetings and community events. He was good at it, respected for his ability to find compromise solutions that satisfied most parties, but his work had never made him jumpy like this. The drive to Millbrook High School took us through the heart of our town, past the Victorian houses that had been converted into law offices and boutique shops, past the park where Tyler had played Little League baseball, past the library where I'd spent countless hours helping him with research projects. 20 years of memories lined these streets, 2 decades of building a life together in this community where everyone knew everyone else's business. Millbrook High's parking lot was already crowded when we arrived, families streaming toward the gymnasium, decorated with the school colors of blue and gold. I immediately began scanning the crowd for photo opportunities, my photographer's eye automatically framing shots of proud parents, nervous graduates, and the general festive atmosphere that surrounded such milestone events. That's when I first noticed Derek's odd behavior with the camera. As we approached the school entrance, another parent called out. "Derek, Natalie, let me get a picture of you three." Mrs. Patterson from down the street was already raising her camera, but Derek immediately stepped behind Tyler and me, mumbling something about needing to check his phone. "Dad, what's wrong?" Tyler asked, clearly confused by his father's unusual behavior. "Nothing's wrong," Derek said, but his eyes were darting around the crowd in a way that made me think he was looking for someone, or trying to avoid someone. Inside the gymnasium, the familiar ritual of small-town graduations unfolded around us. Folding chairs arranged in neat rows, a makeshift stage decorated with balloons and banners, proud families jockeying for the best seats and camera angle. Derek led us to seats near the middle of the auditorium, a location that struck me as oddly strategic, close enough to see Tyler clearly but far enough from the main photography area to avoid the professional photographers hired by the school. As the ceremony began, I settled into my role as the family documentarian, a position I'd held since Tyler's first day of kindergarten. My camera roll was a comprehensive archive of our son's childhood, birthday parties, Christmas mornings, school plays, soccer games, family vacation. Derek had always been a willing participant in this documentation, often suggesting photo opportunities I might have missed. But today was different. Every time I raised my camera to capture a moment that included Derek, he would find a way to step out of frame. When I tried to get a shot of all three of us during the opening ceremony, he suddenly developed an intense interest in his program. When I attempted to photograph him and Tyler during the scholarship announcements, Derek bent down to tie his shoe. When other parents offered to take family photos, Derek politely declined, claiming he needed to save his phone battery. "Derek, what's going on?" I whispered during one particularly obvious avoidance maneuver. "This is Tyler's graduation. Don't you want pictures?" "Of course I do," he replied, but his eyes were scanning the crowd again rather than looking at me. "I just think we should focus on Tyler today, not worry about getting the perfect shot." His explanation felt hollow, especially coming from the man who had insisted on professional family portraits every year for Christmas cards, who had built elaborate scrapbooks of Tyler's athletic achievements, who had never met a camera he didn't want to pose for. Derek Harper was not a camera-shy person by nature, which made his current behavior all the more puzzling. As the ceremony progressed through the usual graduation rituals, the valedictorian speech, the presentation of awards, the moment when the principal asked the graduates to move their tassels from right to left, I found myself paying more attention to Derek's strange behavior than to the milestone we were supposedly celebrating. It was during the actual diploma presentation that I noticed Tyler was third in line alphabetically, which gave me plenty of time to scan the crowd for the perfect angle to capture his moment on stage. That's when I saw her, a blonde woman in her early 30s, sitting 3 rows ahead of us, and slightly to the right. She was attractive in a polished way, wearing a dress that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget, and she was pointing her camera directly at Derek, not at any of the graduates on stage. The realization hit me like a physical blow. While every other parent in the auditorium was focused on their own child's moment of triumph, this woman was photographing my husband, and Derek, I suddenly understood, was desperately trying to avoid being photographed by her. My hands began to shake as I lowered my own camera, no longer interested in capturing Tyler's diploma moment. Questions flooded my mind faster than I could process them. Who was this woman? Why was she photographing Derek? And most importantly, why was Derek so determined to avoid her camera? Tyler's name was called, and he strode across the stage with the confidence I'd always admired in him. He shook hands with the principal, accepted his diploma, and flashed the brilliant smile that had gotten him out of trouble since he was 5 years old. The moment should have been perfect, the culmination of 18 years of love and support and sacrifice. Instead, I found myself studying the blonde woman's face, trying to read her expression as she continued to focus her camera on Derek, rather than on the young man who was supposed to be the center of attention. There was something calculated about her positioning, something deliberate about the way she was documenting my husband's presence at his own son's graduation. Derek's relief was palpable when Tyler returned to his seat, diploma in hand. He clapped enthusiastically, even stood up to applaud, but he was careful to keep his face turned away from the woman with the camera. The irony wasn't lost on me. The man who had spent 2 decades encouraging me to document every moment of our family's life was now desperately trying to avoid being documented himself. As the ceremony concluded and families began to file out of the gymnasium, I watched Derek's behavior with new eyes. He was practically herding Tyler and me toward the exit, avoiding the traditional post-graduation mingling that usually characterized these events. Other families were gathering for group photos, making plans for celebratory dinners, but Derek seemed focused on getting us out of there as quickly as possible. "Don't you want to congratulate the other graduates?" I asked, knowing that Derek usually enjoyed these social aspects of community events. "We can do that later," he said, his hand on my elbow, gently but firmly guiding me toward the parking lot. "Let's get Tyler home so he can change before dinner." But as we walked toward our car, I caught sight of the blonde woman again. She was talking to another parent, someone I didn't recognize, and they were both looking in our direction. The woman still had her camera in her hands, and I realized with a sinking heart that she had probably gotten the shots she was looking for despite Derek's efforts to avoid her. The drive home was subdued, Tyler chattering about his plans for the summer while Derek and I sat in an increasingly uncomfortable silence. I wanted to ask him directly about the woman, about his strange behavior, about why he was so desperate to avoid being photographed at his own son's graduation. But something held me back, perhaps the fear of what I might discover, or perhaps the hope that there was some innocent explanation for what I had witnessed. Our house on Elm Street had never felt more like a stage set than it did that afternoon. Derek went through the motions of celebratory behavior, opening a bottle of champagne, toasting Tyler's achievement, discussing plans for the family dinner we'd reserved at Romano's, Tyler's favorite restaurant. But there was a performative quality to his enthusiasm, as if he were acting out the role of proud father rather than genuinely experiencing the emotion. I found myself studying him with the same intensity I'd once reserved for film subjects back in my college days, when I still harbored dreams of making documentaries. Derek was handsome, successful, respected in the community. On paper, he was everything a woman could want in a husband. But there were details I was noticing now that I'd somehow missed before, or perhaps chosen to ignore. The way he always angled his body away from windows when we were in public spaces. The way he'd started leaving his phone face down on restaurant tables. The way he'd become increasingly resistant to my suggestions that we update our family photos or create new albums of Tyler's recent achievements. I'd attributed these changes to midlife self-consciousness, the natural result of aging in a youth-obsessed culture. But now I wondered if there were more deliberate reasons behind his camera avoidance. That evening, as Tyler got ready for our celebration dinner, I found myself doing something I'd never done before in 22 years of marriage. I went through Derek's jacket pocket. My hands were shaking as I reached into the inside pocket of the suit jacket he'd worn to graduation, not sure what I expected to find, but knowing I needed to look. What I found was a business card, expensive cardstock with elegant lettering that read Patricia Wells, private investigator. On the back, someone had written a date, today's date, and a time, 2:00 p.m., the exact time of Tyler's graduation ceremony. My legs gave out, and I sank onto our bed, staring at the card in my trembling hands. A private investigator, at Tyler's graduation, taking photos of Derek. The implications crashed over me in waves, each one more devastating than the last. Derek wasn't avoiding cameras out of vanity or self-consciousness. He was avoiding them because he was being investigated. Someone, a spouse, a business partner, a client, had hired Patricia Wells to document his activities, to gather evidence of something Derek clearly didn't want recorded. The sound of Tyler's voice calling from downstairs snapped me back to the present. "Mom, Dad, are you guys ready to go?" I slipped the business card back into Derek's pocket, my mind racing. In a few minutes I would have to sit through a celebratory dinner, pretending to be the happy family we'd always appeared to be while my world crumbled around me. I would have to smile and toast Tyler's future while wondering if my own future was about to implode. But as I stood up and smoothed my dress, checking my reflection in the mirror, I made a decision. I wouldn't confront Derek tonight. Tonight belonged to Tyler, to celebrating his achievement and his bright future. Whatever storm was coming, whatever Derek had done to warrant hiring a private investigator, I would face it tomorrow. Tonight, I would play the role of the proud mother, the supportive wife, the woman who had everything she'd ever wanted. But tomorrow, I would begin the process of discovering who Derek Harper really was, and more importantly, who Natalie Harper might become once the truth came to light. The face staring back at me in the mirror looked the same as it had that morning, but something fundamental had shifted. The woman who had woken up that day thinking she was documenting her son's graduation had discovered she was actually documenting the last day of her old life, and somewhere in the terror of that realization, there was also the faintest stirring of something that might have been relief. The truth, whatever it was, would be devastating. But after 22 years of marriage, 18 years of motherhood, and 43 years of life, I was about to discover what lay beneath the carefully constructed surface of our perfect family. The photographer in me, the documentarian who had set aside her dreams to support someone else's vision, was finally going to get the story that mattered most. The story of what happens when the cameras finally capture what they were meant to see. The celebration dinner at Romano's felt like an elaborate performance, where I was the only one who didn't know the script. Tyler regaled us with stories about his classmates' post-graduation plans, while Derek smiled and nodded at all the right moments, but I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes kept darting to the restaurant's entrance every time the door chimed with new arrival. I pushed food around my plate, my appetite completely gone, while my mind churned through possibilities. What kind of investigation warranted hiring a private detective? Was Derek having an affair? Had he been embezzling money from the county? Was he involved in some kind of illegal development deal? Each scenario felt more surreal than the last, like I was imagining plot lines for a television drama rather than considering the collapse of my own marriage. "Mom, you're not eating," Tyler observed, genuine concern creeping into his voice. "Are you feeling okay?" "Just emotional," I managed, forcing a smile. "You know how mothers get on big days like this." Derek's hand found mine across the table, a gesture that would have been comforting 12 hours earlier, but now felt like another piece of performance art. "She's been planning this day for months," he said to Tyler, squeezing my fingers. "All those photo albums and scrapbooks don't make themselves." The irony of his comment wasn't lost on me. Derek, praising my dedication to documenting our family's life, while simultaneously doing everything possible to avoid being documented himself. I studied his face, searching for signs of deception, but Derek had always been good at compartmentalizing, at presenting the version of himself that the situation required. After dinner, we returned home to find several messages on our answering machine from friends and relatives, congratulating Tyler on his graduation. He disappeared upstairs to video chat with his girlfriend, leaving Derek and me alone in the kitchen for the first time since I'd found Patricia Wells' business card. "That was a good day," Derek said, loosening his tie. "Tyler looked so grown up walking across that stage." "He did," I agreed, watching him carefully, "though I noticed you didn't seem very interested in getting photos today." Derek's hand stilled on his tie for just a moment before he continued undoing the knot. "I was just focused on enjoying the moment, instead of worrying about documenting." "Since when do you not want family photos?" I pressed, testing the waters. "You're usually the one reminding me to charge the camera batteries." "People change, Natalie," he said, but there was a defensive edge to his voice that I'd never heard before. "Maybe I'm just tired of always being behind a lens instead of living in the moment." The comment stung more than he probably intended. For years, Derek had encouraged my photography hobby, had praised my ability to capture meaningful moments, had bragged to his colleagues about my artistic eye. Now apparently, my dedication to preserving our family's memories was something he found burdensome. That night, I lay awake listening to Derek's breathing, wondering if he was actually asleep or just pretending. The man beside me felt like a stranger, someone whose thoughts and motivations I couldn't begin to fathom. After 22 years of marriage, I realized I might not know my husband at all. The next morning brought a return to our usual routines, but everything felt off kilter. Derek left for work at his normal time, kissing me goodbye with the same casual affection he'd shown for years, but I found myself analyzing every gesture for signs of deception. Was that kiss a little too brief? Was his smile a little too bright? Was he relieved to be leaving the house? Tyler slept until noon, exhausted from the post-graduation celebrations with his friends. When he finally emerged from his room, He found me sitting at the kitchen table with my laptop, staring at a blank document. "What are you working on?" he asked, rummaging through the refrigerator for lunch. "Just some ideas," I said vaguely. I'd been trying to write, to process my thoughts, but every sentence felt inadequate to capture the magnitude of what I was facing. "How do you put into words the moment when you realize your entire life might be built on lies?" The doorbell rang, interrupting my attempted writing session. Through the front window, I could see a delivery truck parked in our driveway. The driver handed me a padded envelope addressed to Derek. "No return address, marked personal and confidential." My hands shook as I held the envelope, knowing I should set it aside for Derek to open when he returned from work. Instead, I found myself examining the postmark, the handwriting, looking for clues about the sender's identity. The envelope felt substantial, like it contained more than just documents, perhaps photographs. "Mom, you look like you've seen a ghost," Tyler said, appearing beside me with a sandwich in his hand. "Just tired," I lied, setting the envelope on the hall table where Derek would find it. Still coming down from yesterday's excitement, but as the day wore on, the envelope seemed to pulse with malevolent energy, like a bomb waiting to explode. I found myself walking past the hall table repeatedly, each time fighting the urge to open it. Whatever was inside, I was certain it would confirm my worst fears about Derek's behavior. Derek arrived home that evening with his usual cheerful demeanor, but I noticed how his eyes immediately went to the hall table, how his shoulders tensed when he saw the envelope waiting for him. "Delivery came for you today," I said, trying to keep my voice neutral. "Thanks," he replied, but he made no move to open it. Instead, he headed straight for the shower, leaving the envelope untouched. It wasn't until after dinner, when Tyler had gone out with friends and Derek thought I was absorbed in a television show, that I saw him slip the envelope into his study, the room where he kept his work files, his computer, his private papers, a space I'd always respected as his professional sanctuary. Lying in bed that night, I made a decision that would have been unthinkable a week earlier. I was going to find out what was in that envelope, and more importantly, I was going to discover what Derek was hiding from me. The next morning, after Derek left for work and Tyler departed for his summer job at the local golf course, I found myself standing outside Derek's study. The door was closed but not locked. Derek had never felt the need to lock doors in our own home. My hand trembled as I turned the handle, feeling like I was crossing a line I could never uncross. The study was meticulously organized, just like Derek himself. File cabinets lined one wall, his desk was clear except for a small stack of papers, and his computer hummed quietly in sleep mode. The envelope was nowhere to be seen, which meant he'd either taken it with him, or hidden it somewhere in the room. I started with the obvious places: desk drawers, file cabinets, the small safe where Derek kept our important documents. Nothing. Then I moved to less obvious locations behind books on the shelves, inside other folders, taped to the underside of drawers. Still nothing. It was only when I was about to give up that I noticed something odd about one of the picture frames on Derek's desk. It was a photo of the three of us, from last Christmas, but the frame seemed thicker than necessary for a single photograph. When I carefully removed the backing, I found it. The envelope opened along with its contents. The photographs spilled across Derek's desk like evidence in a crime scene. There were dozens of them, all featuring Derek in various locations around town, but he wasn't alone. In every single photo he was with the same woman, brunette, attractive, probably in her early 30s. They were holding hands, kissing, entering and leaving what appeared to be a hotel room. My legs gave out, and I sank into Derek's desk chair, staring at the evidence of his affair spread out before me. The photos were professionally taken, clearly the work of Patricia Wells, and they told a story I'd been too naive to see. Derek's strange behavior, his avoidance of cameras, his recent emotional distance, it all made perfect sense now. There was also a letter with the photos written on law office letterhead. As I read it, my hands began to shake even more violently. The letter was from an attorney representing someone named Victoria Chambers, and it outlined a paternity claim against Derek. The woman in the photographs wasn't just Derek's mistress. She was claiming he was the father of her 6-month-old daughter, The implications crashed over me in ways. Derek hadn't just been having an affair, he'd potentially fathered a child with another woman. The private investigator had been hired to document their relationship, to gather evidence for either a paternity suit or a divorce proceeding. Derek's desperate avoidance of cameras suddenly made complete sense. He was trying to avoid being photographed with his mistress at public events, where his wife and son would be present. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at the photographs, and reading the letter over and over again. The affair was devastating enough, but the possibility of Derek having another child, of him living a completely separate life while maintaining the facade of our marriage, felt like a betrayal so profound I couldn't quite process. When I finally gathered the strength to stand, my first instinct was to put everything back exactly as I'd found it, to pretend I'd never seen the evidence of Derek's deception, but something stopped me. Instead, I carefully photographed each document and image with my phone, creating my own record of his betrayal. The woman who had spent 22 years documenting other people's lives was finally documenting her own story, and it was uglier than anything she'd ever imagined. The rest of the day passed in a blur of shocked numbness. I moved through the familiar routines of household management, laundry, grocery shopping, meal preparation, but everything felt surreal, like I was watching someone else's life from a distance. When Tyler came home from work, I somehow managed to engage in normal conversation about his day, but internally I was screaming. Derek arrived home that evening with flowers, a gesture that might have been romantic under different circumstances, but now felt like mockery. "Just wanted to say thanks for making Tyler's graduation so special," he said, kissing my cheek with what I now recognized as practiced insincerity. "They're lovely," I managed, arranging the flowers in a vase, while my mind raced. How many times had Derek brought me flowers as a cover for his guilt? How many romantic gestures had been motivated by his need to maintain our facade rather than genuine affection? During dinner, I found myself studying Derek's face, looking for signs of the man who was capable of such elaborate deception. He talked about his day at work, asked Tyler about his summer job, discussed plans for a family vacation we'd been considering. He was the same man he'd always been, which made his betrayal even more devastating. After Tyler went to bed, Derek and I settled into our usual evening routine. He read architectural magazines while I worked on photo albums. But tonight, the familiar activities felt like elaborate theater. Derek wasn't really reading. I could see his eyes weren't moving across the page, and I wasn't really organizing photos. I was trying to figure out how to confront him about what I'd discovered. "Derek," I said finally, my voice sounding strangely calm, "is there anything you want to tell me?" He looked up from his magazine, his expression carefully neutral. "About what?" "About anything. About your life, your work, your relationship." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. For a moment, I thought he might confess everything. Something flickered in his eyes. Fear, perhaps, or relief at the possibility of finally being honest. But then his professional mask slipped back into place. "I'm not sure what you're getting at, Natalie," he said, returning to his magazine. "Is there something specific you want to discuss?" The casual dismissal of my question felt like another betrayal. Even confronted with the opportunity to come clean, Derek was choosing to continue his deception. I realized then that whatever confrontation was coming, I would have to initiate it. Derek wasn't going to volunteer the truth. That night, I lay in bed next to my husband of 22 years, listening to him breathe, wondering if he was dreaming about another woman. The man who had once been my closest confidant, my partner in raising Tyler, my companion through 2 decades of life's ups and downs, had become a stranger whose inner life was completely alien to me. I thought about Victoria Chambers, the woman in the photographs. She looked young, vibrant, completely different from the middle-aged wife Derek went home to every night. Had he told her about me? Did she know she was involved with a married man? Or had Derek constructed an elaborate lie about his home life? And what about the baby? The letter mentioned a 6-month-old daughter, which meant Derek had been living this double life for at least 15 months. While I'd been planning Tyler's graduation, shopping for his senior year, helping him with college applications, Derek had been creating another family entirely. The betrayal was so complete, so devastating, that I found myself oddly detached from it. This couldn't be my life, couldn't be my marriage, couldn't be the man I'd trusted with my heart and my future. But the evidence was undeniable, captured in high-resolution photographs that left no room for alternative interpretations. As dawn broke over Millbrook, I made a decision that would have been impossible just days earlier. I wasn't going to confront Derek immediately. Instead, I was going to do my own investigation, gather my own evidence, and figure out exactly what my options were before I revealed what I knew. The woman who had spent decades documenting other people's stories was finally ready to take control of her own narrative, and the first step was discovering just how deep Derek's deception went, and what she was going to do about it. I slipped out of bed while Derek was still sleeping, powered up my laptop, and began researching divorce attorneys in Denver. The photographer in me understood the importance of documentation, of building a case, of preparing for whatever came next. Derek might have thought he was controlling this situation, but he was about to discover that his wife was much stronger than he'd ever imagined. The sun was rising over the mountains that surrounded our town, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. It was going to be a beautiful day, the kind of perfect Colorado morning that had made me fall in love with this place 20 years ago. But for the first time in decades, I wasn't thinking about how to capture the moment with my camera. Instead, I was planning how to capture my future. The law office of Carmen Rodriguez occupied the second floor of a converted Victorian house in downtown Denver, 30 minutes from Millbrook, but a world away from the small-town atmosphere where Derek and I had built our life. I'd chosen Carmen based on her online reviews and her specialization in high-asset divorce cases, but mostly because she was far enough from our community that I could conduct my business without running into anyone Derek and I knew socially. Carmen was nothing like the aggressive, shark-like attorney I'd expected. Instead, she was a woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair and kind eyes that somehow managed to convey both compassion and steel. Her office was warm and inviting, filled with plants and artwork that made the difficult conversations she facilitated feel less clinical. "Tell me what brought you here today," Carmen said, settling into her chair across from me with a yellow legal pad and a cup of coffee. I'd rehearsed this moment during the drive from Millbrook, but sitting in her office the words felt inadequate. "I discovered that my husband has been having an affair, and there's a paternity claim against him." Carmen's expression didn't change, but she leaned forward slightly. "How long have you been married?" 22 years. We have one son, Tyler. He just graduated from high school." My voice cracked slightly on Tyler's name. Throughout this nightmare, the impact on our son had been my greatest fear. "And how did you discover the affair?" I pulled out my phone and showed her the photographs I'd taken of Derek's evidence. Carmen studied them carefully, occasionally making notes on her legal pad. Her professional demeanor was reassuring. She'd clearly handled situations like this before. "These appear to be surveillance photos," she observed. "Do you know who hired the private investigator?" The letter mentioned an attorney representing Victoria Chambers. "I assume she's the woman in the photos." Carmen nodded. "It's likely she's building a case for either paternity or child support. The photographs establish a relationship between her and your husband." She looked up from the images. "What are your goals in this situation, Natalie?" It was a question I'd been asking myself for days. "I want to understand the full scope of what Derek's been hiding. I want to protect Tyler from as much of this as possible. And I want to make sure I'm not left with nothing when this all comes out." "Smart priorities," Carmen said. "Let's start with the practical matter. Do you have access to your financial records?" Over the next hour, Carmen walked me through the process of gathering documentation, bank statements, investment accounts, property records, tax return. She explained Colorado's laws regarding marital property and child support, painted a picture of what divorce proceedings might look like, and outlined steps I could take to protect myself financially. "I'd recommend hiring our own private investigator," she suggested. "If there's one affair, there might be others. If there's one child, there might be more. The more we know about Derek's activities, the better we can protect your interest." The idea of hiring someone to spy on my husband felt surreal, but Carmen's matter-of-fact approach made it seem like a necessary business decision rather than an act of betrayal. She gave me the contact information for Frank Sullivan, a former police detective who specialized in domestic investigations. Frank is discreet and thorough, Carmen assured me. He'll help us understand exactly what we're dealing with. Driving back to Millbrook, I felt simultaneously empowered and terrified. For the first time since discovering Derek's betrayal, I was taking action rather than simply react, but I was also stepping into a world I'd never imagined inhabiting, a world of divorce attorneys and private investigators, of asset protection and custody arrangement. The mountains that surrounded our town looked different to me now, less like a protective embrace and more like barriers that had kept me isolated from the broader world. I'd spent 20 years creating a life within these boundaries, but now I was beginning to understand that my world needed to expand far beyond Millbrook's comfortable confines. When I arrived home, Tyler was in the kitchen making a sandwich, still in his golf course uniform. "How was your day in Denver?" he asked, and I realized I'd told him I was going shopping. "Fine," I said, hoping my voice sounded normal. "Just picked up a few things." Tyler nodded absently, focused on his phone. At 18, he was naturally self-absorbed, which made it easier to hide my emotional turmoil, but I knew that wouldn't last forever. Eventually I would have to tell him about Derek's affair, about the divorce, about the half-sister he might have somewhere. That evening, Derek arrived home with his usual cheerful demeanor, but I found myself studying him with new eyes. How had I missed the signs of his deception for so long? Were there clues I'd ignored, red flags I'd rationalized away? "How was your day?" he asked, kissing my cheek with what I now recognized as practiced affection. "Quiet," I replied. "Just ran some errands." We fell into our usual evening routine, but everything felt different. Derek's casual questions about my day now felt like interrogation. His affectionate gestures now felt like manipulations. Even his presence in our shared space felt like an intrusion. After Tyler went to bed, Derek settled into his study to work on some project files. I used the opportunity to begin my own investigation, starting with our shared computer and looking for any traces of Derek's secret life. What I found was both more and less than I'd expect. Derek had been careful. There were no incriminating emails in his regular account, no suspicious browser history, no obvious signs of deception. But there were subtle clues that painted a picture of a man living a double life. Credit card statements showed regular charges at restaurants and hotels that didn't correspond to any business meetings or family activities I remembered. There were cash withdrawals from ATMs in Denver on days when Derek claimed to be working late at the office. Cell phone records showed frequent calls to a number I didn't recognize, always during business hours when I wouldn't be likely to notice. The evidence was circumstantial but damning. Derek hadn't just been having an affair, he'd been conducting it with the same meticulous planning he brought to his professional projects. Every detail had been carefully considered, every potential exposure minimized. But as I dug deeper into our financial records, I discovered something that made my blood run cold. Derek had been moving money, small amounts, transferred regularly to an account I'd never seen before. Over the past 18 months, he'd diverted nearly $50,000 from our joint savings into this mystery account. The timeline was devastating. 18 months ago was when Victoria Chambers would have gotten pregnant. Derek hadn't just been supporting his mistress emotionally, he'd been supporting her financially with money that belonged to our family. I printed out the bank statements and hid them in my photo album collection, knowing Derek would never think to look there. The woman who had spent decades documenting other people's lives was now creating her own evidence file, building a case against the man she'd once trusted completely. Frank Sullivan called me the next morning while Derek was at work and Tyler was at his summer job. His voice was gravelly but reassuring, like a favorite uncle who happened to be really good at uncovering secrets. "Carmen Rodriguez gave me your contact information," he said. "She mentioned you might need some investigative services." We agreed to meet at a coffee shop in a small town between Denver and Millbrook, somewhere Derek was unlikely to recognize either of. Frank turned out to be a bear of a man with gray hair and kind eyes, wearing a flannel shirt and jeans that made him look more like a retired rancher than a private investigator. "I've been doing this for 20 years, he told me over coffee. "I've seen it all, so nothing you tell me is going to shock me, but I need you to be completely honest about what you want to know and what you're prepared to hear." I showed him the photographs and documents I'd discovered, explained Derek's strange behavior, and outlined my suspicions about the scope of his deception. Frank listened without judgment, occasionally asking clarifying questions or making notes in a small notebook. "Your husband sounds like a careful man," Frank observed, "but careful people often have patterns, and patterns can be tracked. Give me 2 weeks, and I'll have a complete picture of his activities." The waiting was the hardest part. For 2 weeks, I went through the motions of normal life, while Frank conducted his investigation. Derek continued his routine of work, family dinners and evening projects, seemingly unaware that his secret life was being documented by someone even more skilled than Patricia Well. Tyler was busy with his summer job and preparations for college, which provided a welcome distraction from the tension I was feeling. He was excited about his future, full of dreams and possibilities, blissfully unaware that his family was about to implode. I found myself studying Tyler during these weeks, looking for any similarities to Derek that might help me understand how my husband had become capable of such elaborate deception. But Tyler was straightforward, honest to a fault, incapable of the kind of sustained dishonesty that Derek had been practicing. When Frank called to schedule our follow-up meeting, I knew my period of uncertain waiting was about to end. We met at the same coffee shop, but this time Frank carried a manila envelope that seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. "I'm going to be direct with you," Frank said, settling into his chair. "Your husband has been living a double life for at least 2 years, probably long. Victoria Chambers isn't his first affair, and she's not his only current relationship." The words hit me like physical blows. Not his first affair, not his only current relationship. I'd been prepared for the confirmation of Derek's betrayal, but the scope of his deception was beyond anything I'd imagined. Frank opened the envelope and spread photographs across the table. Derek with Victoria Chambers, just as I'd seen before. But there were also photos of Derek with other women, a redhead, who looked to be in her 40s, a young blonde, who couldn't have been much older than Tyler, a brunette with expensive clothes and jewelry. "The pattern seems to be that he maintains one primary relationship," Frank explained, "and several secondary ones. Victoria Chambers appears to be the primary one currently, but that could change." I stared at the photographs, trying to process the magnitude of Derek's betrayal. This wasn't just an affair, or even multiple affairs. This was a completely separate life, a systematic deception that had been going on for years. The financial investigation was equally revealing, Frank continued. "Your husband has been supporting multiple women financially. The account you discovered was just one of several. He's been moving money out of your joint assets for at least 3 years." Frank pulled out a financial summary that made my head spin. Derek had diverted over $200,000 from our family's assets to support his various relationships. Money that should have been going toward Tyler's college fund, toward our retirement, toward our family's future had been spent on hotel rooms and expensive dinners with other women. "There's more," Frank said gently. "Victoria Chambers' paternity claim is legitimate. The DNA test confirms Derek is the father of her daughter, but there's also evidence suggesting he may have fathered another child with a different woman 3 years ago." I felt disconnected from my own body, like I was watching this conversation happen to someone else. 2 children, multiple affairs, hundreds of thousands of dollars. The scope of Derek's deception was so vast that I couldn't quite process it. "What do I do now?" I asked, my voice sounding small and lost. Frank's expression was compassionate but firm. "You protect yourself and your son, you document everything, you prepare for the storm that's coming, because once this becomes public, your life is going to change completely." Driving home from that meeting, I felt like I was returning to a foreign country rather than the place I'd called home for 20 years. The familiar streets of Millbrook looked the same, but everything felt different. I was no longer the naive wife who'd been blindly trusting for 2 decades. I was a woman who'd been systematically betrayed by the person she'd trusted most. That evening, I sat in my kitchen and stared at the evidence of Derek's betrayal spread across the table. Photographs, financial records, phone logs, hotel receipts, the documentation of a double life so elaborate it rivaled any fiction I'd ever read. For the first time since discovering Derek's affair, I felt something other than shock and pain. I felt anger, pure, clean anger at the man who'd stolen years of my life, who'd diverted money from our son's future, who'd exposed me to potential health risks without my knowledge or consent. The anger was clarifying. For weeks, I'd been wondering what I'd done wrong, how I'd failed as a wife, what I could have done differently to prevent Derek's betrayal. But looking at the evidence of his systematic deception, I realized this wasn't about me at all. This was about Derek's choices, Derek's lies, Derek's fundamental dishonesty. I wasn't the victim of a momentary lapse in judgment or a midlife crisis. I was the victim of a man who'd been living a lie for years, who'd been stealing from his own family to fund his deceptions, who'd been putting my health and financial security at risk for his own selfish gratification. The woman who'd spent decades documenting other people's stories was finally ready to take control of her own narrative, and the first step was deciding what she wanted that narrative to look like. Tyler came home from work that evening to find me in the kitchen, making his favorite dinner. He was excited about a party his friends were throwing for the weekend, chattering about college, orientation, and fall classes. His enthusiasm was infectious, and for a moment, I could almost forget about the envelope of evidence hidden in my photo album. "Mom, you seem different lately," Tyler observed, helping himself to seconds. "More focused or something. It's like you're planning something." Out of the mouths of babes. I was planning something. I was planning my escape from a marriage built on lies, my transition from dependent wife to independent woman, my son's protection from the chaos that was coming. Just thinking about the future, I told him, which was true, and about what I want the next chapter of my life to look like. Tyler nodded, satisfied with my answer. At 18, he was naturally forward-looking, already mentally preparing for the independence of college life. He couldn't imagine that his mother might be preparing for her own form of independence. That night, after Derek fell asleep, I sat in my study and began making lists, things I needed to do, people I needed to contact, decisions I needed to make. The photographer in me understood the importance of preparation, of having all the equipment ready before the crucial moment arrived. I was done being Derek's victim. I was done being the naive wife who believed whatever story her husband told her. I was done funding his deceptions with my own ignorance and compliance. The woman who'd spent 22 years documenting other people's lives was finally ready to step out from behind the camera and into the spotlight of her own story. And that story was going to have a very different ending than Derek imagined. The Rocky Mountain Community College campus buzzed with late summer activity. As I walked across the quad toward the continuing education building, students hurried between classes, their backpacks slung over shoulders, their faces bright with possibility. At 43, I felt both ancient and newly born among them, a woman rediscovering herself in the most unexpected of places. 3 weeks had passed since Frank Sullivan had laid out the devastating scope of Derek's betrayal. 3 weeks of careful planning, quiet preparation, and the slow metamorphosis from devastated wife to strategic adversary. But it was Dr. Lisa Chen who had suggested I needed something more than legal preparation and financial planning. I needed to rebuild myself from the inside out. "You've spent 2 decades defining yourself through your relationship to Derek and your role as Tyler's mother," Dr. Chen had observed during one of our therapy sessions. "Now you need to discover who Natalie Harper is when she's not performing those roles." The documentary filmmaking course had been Derek's idea, ironically enough. Years ago, when I'd first mentioned my abandoned dreams of making films, he'd dismissed the notion as impractical. But now, sitting in Professor Martinez's classroom, surrounded by students half my age and twice my enthusiasm, I felt something I'd almost forgotten: excitement about my own potential. "Documentary filmmaking is about revealing truth," Professor Martinez explained on the first day of class. "It's about looking beneath the surface of what people present to the world and finding the authentic story underneath." The words resonated so deeply, they might have been written specifically for my situation. I'd spent months uncovering the truth beneath Derek's carefully constructed facade. Now I was learning to apply those investigative skills to storytelling, to take the observational abilities I'd developed as a family photographer and transform them into something more powerful. My first assignment was to create a 5-minute documentary about someone in my community. While other students chose local business owners or interesting neighbors, I found myself drawn to Carmen Rodriguez, the attorney who'd helped me understand my legal rights, had a story that deserved telling. I never intended to specialize in divorce law, Carmen told me during our interview, her office transformed into an intimate confession booth by the warm lighting I'd learned to create. I started out doing corporate work, but I kept getting referrals from women who needed help. Women like you, actually, who'd spent years building someone else's dream, and suddenly found themselves with nothing to call their own. Carmen's story unfolded like a revelation. She'd been married to an investment banker, who'd controlled every aspect of their financial life. When she'd discovered his embezzlement from client accounts, she'd not only lost her marriage, but nearly lost her law license defending herself against accusations of complicity. That's when I understood that legal expertise isn't enough, Carmen continued, her weathered hands folded in her lap. Women need more than just competent representation, they need someone who understands what it feels like to have your entire identity stripped away, to start over when you thought your life was already built. Filming Carmen's interview, I felt something click into place. The technical aspects of documentary work that had seemed overwhelming in the classroom, lighting, audio, camera angles, became intuitive when I was focused on revealing someone's authentic truth. This was what I'd been meant to do, what I'd abandoned when I'd convinced myself that Derek's dreams were more important than my own. The editing process became my salvation during those difficult weeks of waiting for the legal machinery to move forward. While Derek continued his oblivious routine of work and family dinners, I spent my evenings in the college's media lab, crafting Carmen's story into something that honored both her struggle and her strength. You have a natural eye for this, Professor Martinez told me after screening my documentary for the class. There's an emotional intelligence in your work that can't be taught. Have you considered pursuing this more seriously? The question haunted me as I drove home through the mountain darkness. Had I considered pursuing this more seriously? For 22 years, I'd considered Derek's career, Tyler's needs, our family's stability, but my own dreams had been relegated to someday, maybe when the time was right. Now, facing the collapse of everything I'd thought was permanent, I was discovering that the time was finally right, not because circumstances were perfect, but because I was finally ready to claim space for my own aspirations. The transformation wasn't just happening in the classroom. Carmen had introduced me to other women who'd rebuilt their lives after devastating betrayals, and their stories became the foundation for my growing confidence. There was Rebecca, a former banker's wife, who'd started a nonprofit helping women achieve financial literacy after discovering her husband had gambled away their children's college funds. There was Sarah, whose husband's secret addiction had cost them their home, and who'd become a substance abuse counselor. There was Maya, who'd turned her experience with domestic violence into advocacy work that had changed state legislation. Each woman's story followed a similar pattern: devastating discovery, period of survival and struggle, gradual rebuilding, and eventual transformation into someone stronger than they'd ever imagined possible. I began to see my own experience not as a unique tragedy, but as part of a larger narrative of women reclaiming their power after betrayal. The photography skills I'd developed over 2 decades became the foundation for my emerging documentary work, but instead of capturing Tyler's soccer games and family vacations, I was documenting stories of resilience and transformation. My camera became a tool for revealing truth rather than preserving illusion. Doc Chan encouraged me to explore how my role as family documentarian had actually prepared me for this transition. You've been observing human behavior, capturing authentic moments, telling stories through images for years, she pointed out. The only difference now is that you're doing it with intention rather than instinct. Tyler noticed the changes first. "Mom, you seem different," he observed one evening, as I worked on editing my second documentary project in the living room. "More like yourself, if that makes sense." It made perfect sense. For the first time in years, I was pursuing something that belonged entirely to me, something Derek couldn't control or diminish or redirect toward his own purposes. The woman who'd spent decades making herself smaller to accommodate her husband's expanding ego was finally giving herself permission to grow. The financial planning Carmen had recommended was proceeding in parallel with my personal transformation. I'd opened my own bank account, established credit in my own name, and begun the process of documenting assets that Derek had been systematically hiding. Frank Sullivan's investigation had revealed not just the extent of Derek's affairs, but also a complex web of financial deception that would take months to untangle completely. "Your husband has been living well beyond his means for years," Carmen explained during one of our strategy sessions. "The affairs weren't just emotional betrayals, they were expensive. He's been funding multiple relationships with money that belonged to your family." The numbers were staggering. Hotel rooms, expensive dinners, jewelry, travel, rent for apartments where Derek's mistresses lived. The costs had been adding up for years. Derek had been stealing from Tyler's college fund, from our retirement savings, from the emergency account we'd built for unexpected expenses. But knowledge was power, and the more I understood about Derek's financial deceptions, the better positioned I became to protect myself and Tyler from the consequences of his choices. Carmen was building a case that would ensure Derek's infidelity and financial betrayals would be taken into account during divorce proceedings. Meanwhile, my documentary work was opening doors I'd never expected. Professor Martinez had submitted my film about Carmen to a regional festival, where it won an award for emerging filmmaker. The recognition led to an invitation to speak at a conference for women entrepreneurs, which led to contacts with organizations that supported women rebuilding their lives after domestic and financial abuse. "There's a need for someone with your skills and perspective," explained Maria Santos, the director of a nonprofit that provided services to women escaping abusive relationships. "We have counselors and lawyers and financial advisors, but we don't have anyone who can help these women tell their own stories, who can document their transformation in a way that might inspire others." The job offer was part-time initially, with the possibility of expansion based on funding and program development. It would mean traveling throughout Colorado, working with women whose experiences ranged from physical abuse to financial manipulation to emotional control. It would mean using my emerging documentary skills to create films that could serve both therapeutic and educational purposes. For the first time since discovering Derek's betrayal, I felt something that resembled excitement about my future. This wasn't just survival or recovery, this was the possibility of a life more meaningful than anything I'd previously imagined. But accepting the position would mean making my intentions clear to Derek, would mean abandoning the pretense that our marriage might somehow survive his betrayal. It would mean stepping fully into the identity I was building, rather than maintaining the facade of the woman I'd been. The decision crystallized during a family dinner that felt like performance art. Derek talked about a development project he was excited about. Tyler shared news about his college roommate assignment, and I sat there thinking about the women whose stories I might be able to help tell, the films I might be able to make, the life I might be able to build if I was brave enough to claim it. "Earth to Mom," Tyler said, waving his hand in front of my face. "Dad asked if you wanted to take that vacation to Yellowstone before I leave for college." I looked at Derek, really looked at him, and saw a strange, the man who'd been lying to me for years, who'd been stealing from our family, who'd been building relationships with other women while I'd been faithfully maintaining our home and raising our son. The man who still believed he could control the narrative of our marriage, who thought I was too naive or too dependent to challenge his version of reality. "I think I'll be too busy," I said, my voice steadier than I'd expected. "I've got some projects coming up that I'm excited about." Derek's fork paused halfway to his mouth. "Projects? Documentary work. I'm starting a new job with a nonprofit organization." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Tyler looked excited, Derek looked confused, and I felt something that might have been pride. For the first time in years, I was making an announcement about my own life, my own choices, my own future. "I didn't know you were looking for work," Derek said carefully. "There are a lot of things you don't know about me," I replied, meeting his eyes directly. "I'm discovering that myself." Later that evening, after Tyler had gone out with friends and Derek had retreated to his study, I sat in the living room reviewing footage from my latest documentary project. The subject was a woman named Jennifer who'd rebuilt her life after discovering her husband's gambling addiction had cost them their home and their children's college funds. "The hardest part wasn't losing the house or the money," Jennifer said in the interview I was editing. The hardest part was realizing I'd been living with someone I didn't know at all. That the man I'd trusted completely had been lying to me every single day for years. Her words could have been my own, but Jennifer's story didn't end with devastation. It ended with transformation. She'd become a financial counselor, helping other women understand credit and investments and asset protection. She'd turned her betrayal into expertise, her pain into purpose. Watching Jennifer's story unfold on my computer screen, I realized I was no longer just documenting other women's transformations. I was living my own. The skills I was developing, the confidence I was building, the network I was creating, all of it was preparation for a life I was finally ready to claim. My phone buzzed with a text message from Frank Sullivan. Update on financial investigation. Can we meet tomorrow? Important development. I stared at the message, knowing it probably contained more devastating revelations about Derek's deceptions. But instead of the sick dread I'd felt when receiving similar messages weeks earlier, I felt something closer to anticipation. Whatever Frank had discovered, I was ready to handle. The woman who'd been destroyed by the first revelation of Derek's betrayal had been replaced by someone stronger, someone capable of facing whatever truth emerged. The documentary filmmaker in me understood that every story needs conflict to drive character development. Derek's betrayal had been the inciting incident, but my education, my new career, my growing confidence, these were the plot points that would determine how my story ended. And for the first time since Tyler's graduation day, I was genuinely excited to find out what happened next. Outside, the Colorado mountains stood silhouetted against the star-filled sky, the same view I'd admired for 20 years, but somehow seeing it differently now. Those mountains had always seemed like boundaries to me, defining the limits of my world. But now they looked like a foundation, solid ground from which I could launch whatever came next. Derek was still in his study, probably working on projects that would benefit his career, advance his reputation, strengthen his position in the community. But I was no longer interested in building Derek's dreams. I was finally ready to build my own. The woman who'd spent decades behind the camera, documenting other people's lives, was finally ready to step into the spotlight of her own story. And that story was just beginning. Frank Sullivan's coffee shop meeting revealed the final pieces of Derek's elaborate deception. The financial investigation had uncovered offshore accounts, hidden assets, and a pattern of systematic theft that stretched back nearly 5 years. Derek hadn't just been unfaithful, he'd been preparing for his own escape, building a financial foundation that would allow him to abandon his family when it became convenient. Your husband has been planning this for a long time, Frank explained, spreading documents across our usual table. The offshore accounts, the hidden investments, the properties purchased under corporate names. This isn't the behavior of someone having a midlife crisis. This is someone methodically dismantling a marriage while positioning himself for a different future. The scope of Derek's planning was breathtaking in its thoroughness. He'd established business entities in states with favorable asset protection laws, moved money through a series of accounts designed to obscure its origin, and even purchased a condominium in Denver under a corporate name that traced back to him through multiple shell companies. He's been living in that condo part-time for over a year, Frank continued. Victoria Chambers has keys, but so do at least 2 other women. It's essentially his bachelor pad, funded entirely with money diverted from your family's assets. I stared at the photographs of the Denver condominium, sleek, modern, expensive, and realized Derek had been building a parallel life, while I'd been faithfully maintaining our family home in Millbrook. While I'd been planning Tyler's graduation celebration, Derek had been planning his own liberation. There's more, Frank said gently. We found evidence that Derek has been consulting with his own divorce attorney for 6 months. He's been preparing to leave you, but on his own timeline and his own terms. The revelation was both devastating and clarifying. Derek hadn't been caught off guard by my discovery of his affair. He'd been planning to initiate the divorce himself, probably after Tyler left for college, when he could minimize the disruption to his public image and maximize his financial advantage. Carmen's strategy session that afternoon felt like preparing for war rather than divorce proceeding. The evidence Frank had gathered painted a picture of financial fraud that went beyond marital infidelity into potential criminal territory. Derek had been using his position with the county to identify and purchase properties ahead of development announcements, profiting from inside information, while claiming the transactions were legitimate investment. We have grounds for both a substantial financial settlement and potential criminal charges, Carmen explained, but we need to be strategic about how we proceed. Derek is well connected in this community, and he's been positioning himself as the victim of your abandonment. The idea that Derek was portraying himself as abandoned was almost laughable, except for the cold calculation it revealed. He'd been telling his friends and colleagues that I was going through some kind of midlife crisis, that I was being unreasonable and difficult, that he was doing everything he could to hold our marriage together. The good news is that we have documentation of everything, Carmen continued. Frank's investigation has been thorough, and Derek's own records provide evidence of his deceptions. When we're ready to move, we'll have an overwhelming case, but I was no longer interested in simply winning a legal battle. The months of preparation, education, and personal growth had transformed my goals entirely. I didn't want to destroy Derek, I wanted to be free of him. I didn't want revenge, I wanted independence. Most importantly, I didn't want to waste any more energy on a man who'd never deserved my trust in the first place. I want to confront him myself, I told Carmen, before the lawyers and the court filings and the public spectacle. I want him to know that I know everything, and I want him to understand exactly who he's been underestimating. Carmen looked concerned. That's not usually advisable. Confrontations can be unpredictable, and anything you say could potentially be used against you later. Then I'll be careful about what I say, I replied. But Derek needs to understand that his timeline doesn't control this situation anymore. I'm ready to take charge of my own narrative. The opportunity came sooner than expected. Tyler left for college orientation week, giving me several days when Derek and I would be alone in the house together. On his first evening back from the college tour, Derek seemed unusually relaxed, probably thinking he had more time to execute whatever exit strategy he'd been planning. Tyler seems excited about college, Derek said over dinner, making conversation that felt increasingly surreal given what I now knew about his secret life. He is, I agreed. It's amazing how much he's grown this year, how much we've all grown. Derek glanced up from his plate, perhaps hearing something different in my tone. What do you mean? I mean that this year has been full of discoveries, I said carefully, about Tyler's potential, about his future, about what happens when young people are ready to become independent. That's true, Derek said, but he was studying my face now with the same careful attention he'd once reserved for reading development proposal. After dinner, I retreated to the living room, with my laptop, ostensibly working on documentary footage, but actually preparing for the conversation that would end my marriage. Derek eventually joined me, settling into his usual chair, with a glass of wine and a stack of work files. Derek, I said, closing my laptop and turning to face him directly, we need to talk. Something in my voice must have triggered his alarm because his posture immediately became defensive. I pulled out my phone and showed him one of the photographs Frank had taken. Derek and Victoria Chambers entering the Denver condominium, her hand in his, both of them laughing at some private joke. Derek's face went through a series of expressions: shock, fear, calculation, and finally resignation. He set down his wine glass and leaned back in his chair, no longer bothering to maintain the facade of innocent confusion. How long have you known? He asked. Months, I replied. Long enough to understand the full scope of what you've been doing. Derek nodded slowly, and I could see him shifting into damage control mode. Natalie, I know this looks bad, but it's not what you think. Victoria and it's complicated. It's not complicated at all, I interrupt. You've been stealing money from our family to fund multiple affairs while planning to divorce me on your own timeline. You've been building a separate life while lying to me every single day for years. Derek's careful composure cracked slightly. You don't understand the pressure I've been under, the responsibilities. Our marriage has been stagnant for years, and I needed something that made me feel alive again. The explanation was so predictably selfish that I almost laughed. Our marriage was stagnant because you made it stagnant. You systematically discouraged my interests, controlled our finances, and isolated me from opportunities for growth. You created the very problems you're now using to justify your betrayal. That's not fair, Derek protested. I supported your photography hobby. I encouraged your involvement in Tyler's activities. You supported the parts of my life that served your purposes. I corrected. The moment I showed interest in anything independent, you found ways to discourage it. But that's not even the worst part, Derek. The worst part is that you've been planning to abandon Tyler and me while making us complicit in funding your escape. Derek stood up and began pacing, his usual calm control finally dissolving. What do you want from me, Natalie? An apology? A promise to end the affairs? Because I can do that. We can work through this if you're willing to be reasonable. I don't want anything from you except a divorce, I said, my voice steadier than I'd expect. I want you to sign whatever papers Carmen Rodriguez puts in front of you, and I want you to disappear from my life with whatever assets the court decides you're entitled to after your fraud is taken into account. Derek stopped pacing and stared at me. Carmen Rodriguez, you've hired a lawyer. I've hired the best divorce attorney in Colorado, I replied. I've also hired a private investigator, a financial advisor, and a therapist. I've been preparing for this conversation for months, while you've been assuming I was too naive to see what was happening right in front of me. Natalie, let's be reasonable here, Derek said, his tone shifting to the persuasive mode he used in county planning meeting. We have 22 years together, a son, a life. Don't throw all of that away because of some mistakes I made. I'm not throwing anything away, I said. You already threw it away when you decided our marriage was worth less than your secret affairs. You threw it away when you stole money from Tyler's college fund to pay for hotel rooms with other women. You threw it away when you started planning your own divorce without bothering to tell your wife. Derek's face flushed with anger. You can't prove I was planning anything. Those accounts, those investments, they're legitimate business venture. I pulled out my phone again and showed him another photograph. Derek leaving his divorce attorney's office with a folder of documents. Frank Sullivan is very thorough, I said. We have documentation of everything, including your meetings with your own lawyer. For the first time in our entire marriage, I watched Derek realize he'd lost control of a situation. His usual confidence evaporated, replaced by the desperate calculation of someone trying to salvage what he could from a complete disaster. What do you want? He asked finally. I want you to pack whatever personal items you need, and stay at your Denver condo, until our divorce is finalized. I want you to communicate with me only through Carmen, and I want you to understand that Tyler will learn the truth about why our marriage ended, because I'm not going to lie to protect your reputation. Derek's mouth opened and closed several times before he found his voice. You can't tell Tyler about this. He doesn't need to know the details. Tyler deserves to know why his family is being torn apart, I replied. He deserves to understand that his father chose multiple affairs over his family's stability, and he deserves to see what it looks like when someone stands up for themselves instead of accepting unacceptable behavior. Natalie, please, Derek said, and for a moment he looked like the man I'd fallen in love with 22 years ago. Tyler's relationship with me doesn't have to be destroyed by this. Can't we find a way to handle this that protects him? You should have thought about protecting Tyler before you started stealing from his college fund, I said. You should have thought about protecting him before you created multiple families that will complicate his life forever. You don't get to ask for protection now. Derek sank back into his chair, finally understanding that the conversation wasn't a negotiation. I wasn't going to be convinced to minimize his betrayals, or convinced to prioritize his comfort over my own dignity. There's something else you need to know. I've accepted a position with a nonprofit organization. I'll be making documentary films about women rebuilding their lives after domestic and financial abuse. Your betrayal didn't destroy me, Derek. It liberated me. Derek stared at me as if I were speaking a foreign language. You're going to work. I'm going to have a career, I corrected. I'm going to use the skills I developed documenting our family's life to help other women tell their stories. I'm going to turn your betrayal into something meaningful. The conversation continued for another hour, but the outcome was never in doubt. Derek tried various strategies: denial, minimization, bargaining, threats, but I'd spent months preparing for each of them. Every argument he made had been anticipated, every manipulation attempt had been discussed with Dr. Chen, every legal threat had been reviewed with Carmen. When Derek finally left that night, carrying a suitcase of clothes and a box of personal items, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: complete honesty. There were no more secrets to uncover, no more lies to navigate, no more performances to maintain. The elaborate fiction of our marriage had finally collapsed, and underneath it was something real and solid: my own strength. Tyler called the next morning from college, excited about his roommate and his orientation schedule. I didn't tell him about Derek's departure yet, wanting him to focus on his new adventure rather than our family's implosion, but when the time came, I would tell him the truth, not to hurt Derek, or to turn Tyler against his father, but because Tyler deserved to understand what authentic relationships look like. The divorce proceedings moved faster than I'd expected, partly because Derek's own lawyer advised him to accept Carmen's initial offer, rather than risk a trial that would expose his financial crime. Within 6 months I was a single woman with primary custody of Tyler, possession of our family home, and enough financial resources to build whatever life I chose. My first documentary for the nonprofit organization premiered at a film festival in Denver 8 months after Derek left. The film told the story of 3 women who'd rebuilt their lives after discovering their husbands' betrayals, and it won awards for both its technical excellence and its emotional impact. Tyler was in the audience that night, home for winter break from college, where he was thriving academically and socially. He'd handled his parents' divorce with remarkable maturity, understanding that sometimes families have to break apart so individuals can become whole. "I'm proud of you, Mom," he told me after the screening, "not just for the film but for everything, for showing me what it looks like to refuse to settle for less than you deserve." Standing on the stage that night, accepting recognition for work that had grown out of my deepest pain, I thought about Derek's graduation day comment about avoiding cameras. He'd been so afraid of being documented, so desperate to control his image, that he'd missed the real story entirely. The real story wasn't about his affairs or his deceptions. The real story was about a woman who'd spent decades documenting other people's lives finally learning to direct her own. It was about discovering that the most important frame in any photograph is the one that captures authentic truth rather than comfortable illusion. Derek had tried to avoid the cameras, because he was afraid of what they might reveal. But the woman behind the camera had learned something he'd never understood. The truth, however painful, is always more powerful than the most carefully constructed lie. 6 months later, I moved to Portland to head the documentary program for a national organization supporting women's economic independence. Tyler visited me in my new apartment, a space filled with my own artwork and equipment, my own choices and dreams. "You seem different here," he observed, looking around at the life I'd built entirely for myself. "I am different," I replied. "I'm finally the person I was meant to be before I convinced myself that someone else's dreams were more important than my own." The documentary filmmaker who'd once been afraid to step out from behind the camera had finally learned to be the protagonist of her own story, and that story, it turned out, was far more interesting than any fiction Derek could have constructed. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.